And you're trying to get me down with all of it. I don't care, money on your mind, that's all it is. I'm staying out of it. Oh, see, you got dollars in your pockets full of it. And you're wondering if I'm over for the trip. I don't want any of your many poker chips. Already got everything that I want. I know just what they say. Why does she walk away? 'Cause they got money on your mind, it's all it is. And you're trying to get me down with all of it. I don't care, money on your mind, it's all it is. I'm staying out of it. Oh, see, you got dollars in your pockets full of it. And you're wondering if I'm over for the trip. I don't want any of your many poker chips. Already got everything that I want. Yeah, but
Did I overdo it on the money theme in the intro? Perhaps I did. But anyways, welcome to Contributing.today, the open source meetup, which is monthly, streamed online on YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, I don't know where. Anyways, also on Contributing.today, which is conveniently our website. If you want to view some videos of past meetups or interviews, then I totally recommend you checking it out. But not right now, because we are now having this meetup on the wonderful topic of OSS funding and sponsorship. But first, let me point you to the code of conduct and valid for this online session. You can find it at contributing.today, and in the top there will be the code of conduct, and you can check that out. In short, be nice and be friendly and open to others' perspectives. If you want to interact, that's totally fine. Do that in which also links to our Discord channel. If you've not joined that, feel free to join it. There's a fun bunch of people, and we really want to spice up the interaction there. So if you're in need of any contact with people, like to discuss the wonderful topics we discussed here, then just join the chat and also ask your questions to our esteemed guests. So this meetup started a few years back around Hacktoberfest and around FOSDEM. And it was at some point even, which was a bit crazy. So now we went back to monthly. It's organized by three folks who I might call my ex-colleagues and now friends. That is Nick Troch. He's a senior content developer at Microsoft. For Dre's staff developer advocate at iPhone. And I am developer relations lead at Spotify for an open source project called Backstage. If you want to learn more about that, shameless plug, check it out at backstage.io. And we have a meetup next week on Wednesday. Anyways, so over to the wonderful topic of open source, because we all love open source, but we also all know probably that there's also money involved at some. And we're going to discuss that with a few nice guests. So I'm going to welcome the first one, and that is Toby. Welcome, Toby. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk about money.
Thank you for. Yeah, aren't
I'm sorry.
we all? So for the viewers at home, can you introduce yourself a little bit?
Yes, happily so. My name is Toby Langel. I live in Geneva, Switzerland. I've been involved with software and open source now for a very long time, close to 2 decades, I think. And I've seen open source grow from this very niche topic of like a very tiny number of people that were working on really cool software together to something that today essentially powers pretty much everything that has software in it, which today is pretty much everything, and have really become concerned about this change in trajectory of open source that wasn't really accompanied by the sustainability of all of that software that was created and of the people that were creating it. So I've been increasingly concerned and spent an increasing amount of my time focusing on the questions of open source sustainability.
Cool. You must have a lot of thoughts on the current situation. So I'm happy.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah, well, let's discuss that later. Estelle, welcome. Hey.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining. So introduce yourself, viewers at home.
Okay, I'm just having a little bit of audio issues, but my name is Estelle, and I have been working as a web developer for 23 years, I think now. And everything I have ever coded has been open source, but I've actually only been getting paid to do open source work now for 2 years. So everything, while I've opened everything I've ever programmed and put it out onto GitHub and made everything open source, I've only more recently participated with other people to do open source. All of my projects have been independently released rather than working on a framework or a library with a group of people. So now I work with Open Web Docs, and we are a group of web documentarians, and we basically are the ones who write all the content and maintain Mozilla Developer Network with a small team of employees at Mozilla, but we are a separate open source organization funded by, I forget the name of it now, but the Google, Meta, and all the large companies are funding us in small amounts. We'd like more.
Nice. Also a good topic to discuss maybe. And you also do a lot of community stuff, right?
I organize a conference called Perf Matters, which is a web performance conference, and it's also a diversity and inclusion conference. So it's the topic is web performance, but it's really about getting people to be kind to one another and teaching people to be open and inviting and include everyone.
Good.
And I do tons of other stuff too. I'm also writing a book on CSS and writing the HTML documentation for web.dev. And then occasionally I sleep.
I'm going to do all the puns on CSS. Okay, let's introduce our next guest, and that is Phoebe. Hello.
I have to unmute, and I always forget. Hello, everybody. I'm Phoebe. I come from DigitalOcean, where I manage open source programs, one of which is Hacktoberfest. And I feel like I'm standing on the shoulders of giants who created this amazing, wonderful program. And I was formerly at Elastic, where I was with them on their community team as they went through their licensing change. And I've been in the tech industry since 2016, so about 6 years now. And even in that time, I have witnessed just tremendous changes in open source. I have a certificate in software engineering, but I don't really use it. I mostly am focused on marketing programs and initiatives, but really my secret mission is to start an OSPO at DigitalOcean. And so, we run a variety of programs at DigitalOcean that I'll be happy to share about later, but that's me. And I'm based in Boulder, Colorado.
Great having you here. Okay, that brings us to the last guest, and that's Per. Hello.
Hello. So yeah, my name is Per. I currently work in the OSPO at Spotify. Before that, I did somewhat the same thing at Zalando, and before that, I spent 10 years in this small startup doing open source software. And that was back in the day when it was an open source project on the Microsoft platform. So it was kind of an odd time where Microsoft thought open source was terrible. And I think my mom thought it was like a tax scam because she could simply not figure out how we could make money for this thing. So I think that was it started 20 years ago, more or less. So yeah.
Good. Great having you as well. And you mentioned that you're from Spotify, so there was this. I think I need to congratulate you because in the news this popped up.
Yes,
Spotify
from our own news source. Yes, our totally unbiased news about this thing. Yes.
Yes,
well, that was a good. So. Oh. But yeah, I think that was a nice achievement to get that rolling.
Yeah. So how did that come about?
Well, we have been I started at Spotify 5 months ago, and I think along those 5 months we tried to kind of flush out a more coherent strategy for how we want to do open source at Spotify. And the general theme of that, both internally and also in regards to the external thing, is the topic of ownership, of actually taking ownership of this open source topic inside and outside of Spotify. So we kind of understand why we do it, but also what are the mechanisms that could maybe give us a bit more control over what we're doing. And so, of course, we want our internal teams to take ownership of our own code and instead of just throwing it over the fence. But we also have this whole thing of all the dependencies we have, and we desperately rely on them to do the right thing. And there is like our influence is limited. But one thing we can do is we can create an environment where they at least have more resources to do that right thing we actually depend on them doing. So you can say that very much comes down to like something as boring as risk reduction. But in the sense, that is what we're doing. We're trying to create this environment for people we rely on to be able to invest their time into these projects.
Cool, thank you. So let's, that's already what you said there is, I think, a lot of food for a lot of discussion. I can see people like me, like, I want to reply already. Feel free to do so. So let's do a little round, just a warm-up question. So, Toby, let's start with you. What are some of the most notable funding and sponsoring opportunities in open source?
So I'm probably not the best person to answer that question, essentially because being being a consultant, I'm actually less focused on trying to find solutions directly that my company could contribute to. There are, if you want to go back to the basics, like through Open Collective and through GitHub, there are lots of simple ways for people and organizations to sponsor projects. So there's that. I do tend to look at sponsoring with a little bit of a distance and was a little bit of a concern, and we had Contributing Today last year on this topic, right? It doesn't really help solve the underlying systemic issues that I feel like the industry and the open source community are facing. And so I suggest asking that question to someone who has less of a bias against that solution, this problem, if that makes sense.
Okay, well, let's do that, and let's then later maybe discuss more about the underlying problem you're spotting there.
Sure. I mean, I'd love to discuss that. Absolutely.
Estelle, what's your opinion?
So I am not someone who looks for funding. It is actually, like, as a personal thing, I have a very hard time asking people for money, and that is actually why before this career, I was in public health, and I was supposed to become an executive director of an organization, and I was like, I can't ask people for money, so I can't do that. And in tech, I have a hard time asking for money, which is probably why my salary is, going through has been lower than my coworkers. But one of the things I realize is when you're doing something like Open Collective and you're asking individuals for donations, you're talking about $5 here, $10 there, maybe 50, maybe 100. And that cannot pay for a full-time person. That can pay for your server or something else. So you really do have to get corporate sponsorship. The important thing is to get corporate sponsorship from corporations that don't tell you what to do and how to do it. So at Open Web Docs, we're very lucky that basically a lot of people think MDN, which is Mozilla, the developer pages on MDN at Mozilla are really, really important. It's the one place where JavaScript is completely documented, all of the interfaces, all of the APIs. And so many developers are using that. So people want to keep that alive. So people want to sponsor that. So we're really lucky that we have something that so many people rely on and corporations see the value in. And we have been able to get money from certain organizations that has enabled 4 full-time people to work full-time and 1 part-time person. The only thing is it's an annual thing. If they don't renew, we lose our job. It's also, you don't know how much you're going to get. So you keep salaries pretty low so that you don't run out of money. And then everything, because it's an Open Collective thing, if you want to get something to make your life easier, it's public knowledge. So if you're going to buy something like Grammarly because your grammar sucks, and I just showed that my grammar did. Do you want to put that in for reimbursement? Because everyone will see that you got Grammarly, what tools you use. Like you're not going to pay for Dreamweaver. I'm just making a joke because Dreamweaver was always seen as a no-no way back when. I don't know if they still exist, but there's that open source part of it where you might be embarrassed by the tools, so you don't want to ask. Like the openness is makes you more careful about what you're spending money on, and then also the openness is kind of like our team really wants to meet. Will people get upset if we spend money to actually pay for airfare and hotels, because everything is visible, and someone who's donating $5 a month will be like, and you just spent $7,000 to have a meeting for 2 days? Like, I don't want, so it's always a balancing act when you're open source and your financials are open. And that's why it's nice to have corporate sponsorship, because they don't think $7,000. And I just made that number up because we actually haven't met yet. 7,000 is just a drop in the bucket for someone who's a multi-trillion-dollar corporation versus someone who's making ends meet and giving you $5 a month, which is a larger percentage of their annual salary. I don't know.
And then it's only spending if they fin again. So
yeah,
and it's hard to get. Difficult.
It's hard to get new people. The thing is, if they give you $5 a month, that's not enough for you to go back and say thank you. If they're giving you $50 a month, like you can have tiers, and you're kind of like, what you get for that tier. If it's a half an hour of a person's time, then you have to do all the admin of that person's, like Patreon. You're saying basically, if you give me $100 a month, you get an hour of my time every month. Well, that's much easier to do if you're an individual than if you're an actual business, and have multiple employees. Are they taking up an hour of everyone's time? And if basically the admin part, it's open source. We don't have any administrators. Like, we literally don't have HR. We literally don't have benefit. Someone who's taking care of benefits. It's a small organization. It's not a corporation with all of the marketing and everything else that comes with having a larger group of people. And nor would we want to ask funders to fund that.
Well, excuse me if I jump in just there. Why not?
Toby. Sorry.
I don't mean to cut through the whole thing, but I'm wondering. But I am. Right? I'm wondering why not. Why shouldn't funders pay for the whole aspect of supporting a project? Like, we've had this same conversation last year. Where Henry from Babel was saying, we find money to build new features, not to maintain the software, right? And it's actually important to have the software maintained. It's actually important to have the people that maintain the software be able to work together in a normal way. Like, all of these things are important. And yet, it always feels, and you said that before, like the transparency that Open Collective offers becomes sort of an issue, right? Because it puts everything that you do under intense scrutiny, and people don't realize what it actually costs to run a business, what it costs to do marketing, what it costs to make sure that people actually have healthcare, all of these aspects of running a business that, why would there be absent of running a documentation center? Because it's open source, and if it was a museum that was state sponsored, no one would be scrutinizing. They spent money on healthcare and bathrooms. Of course they did. People, people need that stuff to get their job done. So I want to strongly push back and sort of wonder why we're even discussing this.
I think I totally resonate with the idea that there's most open source projects are very small. They're 1, 2, maybe 5, 10 people. And then we have the open source projects that are really huge that everybody relies on. All the Fortune 500, Fortune 1,000 companies rely on for their dependencies. And those are the ones that I think that can really, they're operating as a business, right? And so, yeah, like the question is, how do we fund appropriately? And instead of doing like kind of what I call drip funding, which is this like, okay, we're going to give through Open Collective like 5, 10, 20 per month. How can we do something more significant? So I started getting involved with FOSS funding, which is really more focused on doing like a lump sum, large award of monetary sponsorship, because I think that, that kind of speaks to that. We have operational costs. We have, um, people's jobs that we have to support, and we need to be able to count on them year over year. Being able to give them that large sum of money is really helpful. So one of the things I'm trying to do at DigitalOcean is get us to a place where we can have a FOSS fund, like reorganize our monies. But we kind of do a variety of things. Like we do Open Collective. We do monetary sponsorships of organizations through like an annual sort of subscription kind of a thing. But I think that like being able to just award a large sum of money can be incredibly helpful and kind of solves a little bit that problem. I think where the problem continues is being consistent in that. Like if the way a FOSS fund works is that the engineers in the company vote on the projects that they think are worthy, and they choose 1, 2, or 3, and they, award a lump sum, on a sort of scheduled basis. And that obviously is just for that particular year. So I think for me, the dilemma is, okay, how can we do this year over year and have that, I mean, from the DigitalOcean side, like budgetary wise, how do we account for year over year funding? And that's the question I'm trying to solve.
I think that is the main issue, which is if you get like you can't invest in hiring a new person if you don't know if that money is coming year over year. So like all of our administrative costs, we do have health insurance, but that goes through, we all work like for contract agencies. So I'm employed by Open Web Docs, but my employer is a company called Velocity Global, and they basically have offices in every country that administer HR. So we're paying a large sum of money to this HR organization, but it's nicely hidden in a monthly fee. So no one knows what my actual salary is, because Velocity Global bills for all the employees plus all the health insurance plus their fees. That is kind of a waste of money, because if we hired someone internally, they would be doing all work for us all the time and could do other stuff that we need. But if we go down in funding, who gets laid off first? So it's great that I'd love to see some FOSS funding, but what would really be nice, and this was in the nonprofit world too, which I guess all open sources kind of are in a way, all the funding we always got was always for that year, and you had to spend it before the end of the year. It would be really nice to see donations, which is like, this is going like a 2-year budget. Every time we get a donation, it gets spread out over 2 years. So you can plan, have 18-month or 2-year plans, and someone can work a job for 2 years and not be like, oh my God, I'm going to get fired after 2 years. But someone doesn't want to know like, oh, we don't, it's December and I don't know if the funding's going to come in January. So I don't want to take the job, because what if we don't get the money in January? Then I've lost my job. So it'd be nice to see.
If it even comes. If it even comes. So that brings me to a question. So if you, if a project gets like this huge lump of money, what do you actually do with that? Because that one spike of funding, how to make sense of what to do with it, who decides on that at some point? And how do you, like, for instance, with Open Collective, how do you like communicate that back to your community?
So I think my perspective on how we fund companies, we hope that people just use the money to pay for their time. We don't really want to do anything else. Well, servers and so on is of course important for some projects, but again, if someone is putting in 10, 20 hours into a project every week, they should be paid for that amount of time. So we don't ask any more questions than that. That's our point, is like people's time is valuable here. And if they can't invest their time into this, they're going to spend their time on something else because they need to make a living. So we don't have any demands or requirements on what they spend their time on. If they say they're going to spend whatever money we give them on maintaining, then we don't need to know any more than that. Then we trust them to do the right thing. So yeah.
Yeah, the same for us as well. We don't really get into the details of where the monies are allocated. We just trust that they're going to put that to good use.
The question is, can you put it to good use if you have this small project and you suddenly get like 30 or 40K? What like how to like properly spend that?
You get a bolus of money and you don't know what to do with it.
Yeah,
lottery.
Because if you, well, you know, I think that Estelle made a point. Like, you can't hire, probably can't hire somebody. You can spend it on like I was scrolling through Open Collective recently for, well, non-related reasons. But I was looking into some projects, and like, you suddenly see that they spend like 30 or 40K on some website, blah, 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 blah. I think that's probably well spent money, because like marketing is sometimes not the first thing people think about when we talk money around open source project. But yeah, anyway, my point is, beyond those costs, would people maybe be a bit resistant to like pay themselves with that money?
I think so. When we paid out, or we announced the different receivers of our funds a couple of weeks ago, and we reached out to them and asked them like, what are you actually going to spend the money on? Because we actually wanted to like tell that story. And there was like very different responses, but yeah, I think it's only one or two of them that actually directly said we're just going to spend it on salary so we can actually prioritize open source work over doing consulting. So I think there is I think maintainers are generally hesitant of using this money on themselves. And I think that's a mind shift change we do need to have also in the communities, that maintainers should feel perfectly fine about paying themselves for this work. And actually, if you switch this thing around, that a company has a FOSS fund and pays a project, they have probably been using this software for like the last 5 years. So you could say they haven't paid a dime the last 5 years, and they're actually kind of behind on their payments. So I think maintainers should actually just be perfectly fine just pulling the money out and say, yep, that covers the last 5 years. Thank you very much. That might be in a bit like framing it a bit too negatively, but I think that's the mindset maintainers should have, that they are providing a value to the markets here. And we just don't have the normal mechanisms of capitalism to kind of ensure that people actually pay for these things. So it's a kind of a two-sided problem. Companies have not been forced to pay for this, and on the other side, people have been very hesitant of actually asking for money to just pay themselves. So I think both sides need to kind of move closer into an agreement that it's okay to actually ask for money and find a good way of doing that. And businesses should not complain when people ask for money.
It's an industry-wide problem, though. Oh, sorry, Estelle, please.
I was going to talk about who is working in open source and who is getting paid to work in open source. So I was having a conversation with a woman yesterday who worked on an open source project, and there were 3 people working on the project, 2 men and herself, and she was not paid by her company to work on the project, but the 2 men were. So because they all worked for different companies, and for 2 of them it was part of their job, and for her it was an extracurricular activity. So they actually did a project that brought in money, and she was like, I'd like to be paid. And they were like, no, we should donate this money to, a good cause. So I don't know if they donated it to Black Girls Code or whatever. I'm sure it went to a good cause. But it was interesting because who gets paid to work, which full-time employees get paid to work on open source projects, and who's working on open source projects without getting paid at all. And so I think the people who are saying, oh, we received this $40,000, but we shouldn't pay ourselves, are people who are getting supported by their corporations to work in open source. Whereas there's other people who are at the table, and other people in the same group might not realize that they're doing this all on their free time because their company does not support. Maybe their company supports other people doing this work, but doesn't support them doing this work. So, that's why my entire life, my entire career as a developer, I always open sourced everything on my own because they were like projects that I worked on, but I never had the time to work on an open source project because I was never funded by a company, but I had coworkers who were funded to work on open source projects, just not me. So
yeah, there's a substantial amount of data that shows that women are doing a lot less in open source in general. And I wasn't aware. I mean, like there's an obvious reason behind it is when it's like their free time. Well, there's, statistically, women do a lot more care work than men do, and as a result, they have less time to be able to work for free outside of work, right? So for me, that was the main reason. But what you're telling me is very consistent, like feels, very consistent with what I've observed, and adds insult to injury, really here, because not only is it in general more difficult for women to be able to contribute to open source, and mind you, like contributing to open source has also documented positive impact on people's careers. Right, so it is an accelerator of career, especially if you're working in a corporation. So essentially this this divide between people for whom it is easy to contribute to open source and who get paid for it, and those for whom it is not easy and who do not get paid for it, is it's a huge negative impact on obviously the people that tend to be the most precarious in our industry too. So yeah, wow. I thank you for sharing this.
Well, so what would be a solution for that? Should there be some open source fund which people can get paid by, like for their hours they work, or?
Well, that's an interesting proposition, because I think that we start getting into that, then we start getting into the, I guess, I don't know what the word would be, but the materialization of open source. Like, then you start getting into paying, and I think, Perry, you touched on that a little bit, is that if we start making open source projects paid for, like businesses, like regular businesses, then it no longer is the transparent, open, free thing that we started out with.
Why though? I mean, it's already the case, no?
Yeah, I think like having an open source project doesn't mean that you're anti-commercial and you can't charge for the software you're producing. I think you should definitely enable people to do so. Because they are providing value for companies who are using their code. So I think we should kind of separate the two. Again, I think the idea of like a fund that just generally pays people, I think on my level of preferences and how we kind of fund these things, and this does not work for everything, but I think we should generally be able to look at open source projects as more of a commercial opportunity as well. We should accept that projects will try to go in a commercial direction so they can actually establish a long-term sustainable company around this thing they're building. That is not for all projects. I know that the request library cannot really become a business, but it is for some things. You can actually turn it into a project and actually have a sustainable long-term business. And that would also be a good thing for the consumers of these projects. And then there's other projects that would need to have the support of the Apache Foundation or the Eclipse Foundation, because they're more of these like fundamental, like plumbing parts of the internet that is important to all of us, and that's like a good path for that. And then you have like the more like directly corporate sponsorship for other projects as well. And then there's definitely also projects that's going to fall in a gap which no one really cares about. And that is there. I don't really have a good solution, but I think like my preference is I think we should. Because when you talk about success within open source right now, you basically talk about these like big projects being bought by a tech company, and that's a success metric, or they've been adopted by some foundation, and that's another success metric. I don't believe that. I think open source should also be a way for actually to people to kind of create their own business around this if they wanted to. And I think that's a good way. It's just as open source enables everyone to kind of adopt technology that's out of the reach before, I think we should also think about this in commercial terms. That might be like, I'm totally on my own in that opinion.
I think maybe what needs to be normalized is asking and expecting contributions for users of your open source projects. So it should be normalized that working for open source should be paid. Because right now it's normalized that open source should always be free and everyone should contribute to it in their own free time, just for the free will. And that is why you might have this, so few women or minoritized groups contributing, because they don't have that free time, especially when some people are getting paid, through their jobs to work on it, even though it's open source. So I think what we need to do is normalize like that. When you have an open source project, you have a page that says contributions and a sliding scale. Are you using this? Does your company have more than 10 employees, or does your company maybe make more than $10 billion a year? Then this is what you should contribute if you're using it, for this number of people or something like that. Not saying that everyone should do that, but normalize that it's okay to do that. Because right now, like people, let's just go back to jQuery. Everyone used jQuery. There was a jQuery Foundation. They needed to get donations. But if everyone using a WordPress site was asked for $10, because it was used in every single WordPress site, they could have sponsored the whole thing without having to worry about whether they were going to get funding through their foundation that year. And then everyone who created a different framework would be like, oh, I can work full time on this possibly because people are donating to things like this. So if it's good, I can get donations. So just normalizing it so that people think to ask, and then people think it's normal to give, and that would change the ecosystem.
So let's zoom in on that a little bit. So let's assume that you want to ask for money with an open source project. So where would you go? Where to start? Like we have, of course, we have Open Collective, we have GitHub, but where do you actually find the companies who use maybe your project, and how do you can get them that far that they are willing to pay? I think putting up a page somewhere is will maybe not be that effective.
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, what we do at DigitalOcean, what I've seen many other companies do, is they have an open source page, and on that open source page, they detail how they can help support open source projects. So you can just Google DigitalOcean open source or Microsoft open source, and you can see. And I will say that our open source page is on the cusp of being turned around. Right now, it's just a logo roll of projects that we sponsor.
Check it out in 2 weeks, people. 2 weeks.
Come back in 2 weeks. Right. It's gonna be totally different. But yeah, that's kind of how a lot of the projects that and it's it's a terrible experience right now to try and get sponsorship from DigitalOcean for infrastructure credits, because it's very buried, it's hidden, and that's one of the things that we're fixing with this website update. But even with that, people find us, and it's word of mouth, it's through forums, it's Discord. People share, hey, my project got sponsored. You should check out their application, their information. There you go. There's our sponsorship form. You can go get sponsored. We actually are doing quite a bit of work behind the scenes right now to update this process. And so, but yeah, that's how I would try and find it. But I'd love to hear, how other folks are finding, access.
So last year, when we had this conversation, a very similar conversation here, Henry mentioned that he was spending a huge amount of time just doing podcasts, showing up on recordings like this one to get the attention of folks that would then sponsor the project. And then people would essentially be upset because he was spending time not coding but looking for funds. To Estelle's earlier point of like, why would anyone want to pay for this? And it's interesting because if you look at how this works in the nonprofit world or in politics, right? People spend, in nonprofit, the amount of money, donations that are spent on marketing to get more donations is huge. Like, it's so big. Sometimes it's like 80%, right? Because it's what works and what makes it, it's worth it. So the question here is, I want to go back to something that was said earlier about, getting a huge sum of money, and we're then talking about 30 to 40K. If you're talking about a business running, an engineer, a software engineer today in like Silicon Valley will cost you, like a junior person, at the very little, per year, $250,000, right? And like 200K, roughly across all of the Western world is what it will cost you when you add up like taxes, healthcare, laptop access, blah, 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 right? For one person, 4 year. Like, you're not talking about, so we're talking about like 30K, 100K as a huge sum of money when it would barely pay the salary for one person for 6 months. Like, we're out of whack. Like, the industry is spending $1 trillion per year, roughly, on software engineer salaries, right? And we're talking about, hey, a project just got 30K. Isn't that huge? No, it's not. It's not even a drop in the ocean. Like, no one notices that, and there's no bottom line of anyone involved where that makes a difference, right? So we can't have a serious conversation about long-term sustainability when we at the same time talk about 100K as a huge number. It is a huge number now because, I'm sorry for my French here, but the situation is fucked up. Really deeply fucked, right? And so, that's why it's a huge number, and we have to start thinking differently if we want to solve this problem. And we have to address the fact that things cost money, and it's important to, just acknowledge that, and then only then can we move forward. And I agree, it's a combination of solutions that will get us to a more sustainable place. Very clearly, it's a combination of like funding certain things. Organizations contributing more, some projects becoming businesses. All of these are true, right? But we need to think about all of these things in terms of like millions and possibly $1 billion as kind of what this costs, not 10K, not 20K, not 100K. I said I was going to talk about money.
I agree. I think the numbers we see now are small. And I think also part of the problem is that when you look at it over the industry, there are very few companies who actually donate money or pay for their open source use. I think if everyone generally paid, I don't think for the individual company the amount would not be enormous. It would but it is a very, very low percentage of companies that actually does it right now, and that I think is also part of the problem. And they don't feel obligated to do it. I think my experience with this was spending 10 years in an open source company. Our first option for trying to get funding was we created a content management system which was used by agencies, and they had billable hours for the software, right? So they had a very clear idea of how many hours they could bill because of this software, and we asked them to donate 1% of their billable hours basically to us, If you made a 100,000 euro project, give us 1,000 euros and we would be super happy. And if everyone would do that, we kind of calculated that we had enough money for like 20 full-time staff, basically. And I think in those 10 years I was there, I think we received 2 donations. And that was it. Even though it was on our website from like day one, like this is an option you can do, and they didn't. Instead, they gladly paid like 50, 100,000 euros for like an SLA-based support agreement or like an add-on or like something else, because that's, oh yeah, we are forced to pay for that thing and we can clearly see the value of that. But like just asking people nicely to pay, that for us didn't work. Maybe it's a different time now. Maybe it's much easier, but I don't think companies will just do it out of like the goodness of their heart.
I was just going to say, we get all of our money, people who are donating, it's all through networking. So it's not, there's no advertising that's saying, please donate. It is us, our steering committee asking their companies to donate. I'm sorry, Phoebe, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I'll be, showing my ignorance here in my relatively shorter time in the industry, as, in comparison with this group. But are we talking about potentially like a subscription service, essentially? Like if you're an open source project, you set yourself up so that you can, charge for your services, for the use of your open source? And is that really similar to what we're doing with Open Collective and GitHub sponsors? Because you can essentially set up a system to pay people on almost like a subscription level, and then we're back to the drip. If
you're charging for use of your product, though, are you open source anymore? If so,
could be.
If someone can't use it without paying for it, is it open source?
So technically, no.
Yeah.
Well, this feels very familiar based on the licensing change in Elastic. This was definitely a topic of conversation there too. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I was talking about. And I feel like, we go around on this. It's like, there are always going to be people, I think, in open source who are very dedicated to the idea that, the minute you start charging for it, you lose your ethics. You lose that moral compass that is part of open source's soul and identity. But I think you're right, Toby, that there is a reality to this, which is that everybody is utilizing open source projects right now. We're so dependent on them. And so that's not a sustainable business model for them or for us in the long run.
I mean, the security issues that we've seen over the course of now like close to a decade, but like sort of like intensified recently. I mean, it's a pretty good sign that there's a problem, right? We're seeing increasingly. I mean, one of the last ones, the caller.js and faker.js thing. I mean, outside of the fact that the maintainer is, how to put that in a polite and there's a complicated story behind who that person is and what they did, right? Absolutely. But outside of that, one of their biggest complaint was everyone's using my project, and I'm not getting paid for it, right? And as a result, they literally sabotaged their own project. And I mean, if that is not a sign of something that is deeply wrong from a workers' right perspective, I mean, people, damaging the actual tools that the industry was using to build things. Like there's a really long history of this, right? The Luddites and all of those movements, right? And it was really tied to people being exploited by large companies that were making money off of their work and were not like compensating them properly. So like we're seeing some of that on the labor front, right? But we're also seeing lots of security problems like we had with Heartbleed, like we had with Log4j, that are just due to like, well, it's a project that's in every computer out there that everyone uses to like do really important stuff. I mean, OpenSSL, God, I'm sorry, but like literally what encrypts like 2/3 of communications. What was it? Well, there was one dude that was kind of like working on it whenever they had time to do that, and they had like a $2,000 a year budget. I mean, how does that compute? It doesn't. I mean, I'm sorry if I'm getting a bit like, amped up about this, but like we're literally relying on tools to communicate with our banks that are, maintained by one person on their own time. How does that make any sense? Like, and that's only like the tools that we know directly about. And if we, you start going down dependency trees, it's even worse. And I mean, like, outside of like every other problem, like if this isn't a wake-up call for the industry, like I don't know what will be.
So what is your advice to companies who think they rely on open source or know that they rely on open source, just like you, like to your example? What should they do?
Oh, well, I mean, for me, there are two things that need to happen in parallel, right? One is they have to seriously start looking at the security story behind the software that they're shipping. And thankfully now with the OpenSSF, like there is a real industry movement that's getting started yet. And secondly, they have to start thinking about, well, how can we fix this long term? Because if we only fix the security issue for people consuming software, it's kind of like a gated community attitude, right? It's like, well, who cares whatever happens behind the gates? We're sort of safe. The next thing that's going to happen is, governments today are really pushing about supply chains being software supply chain being secure. The next thing we'll hear about is labor rights within the supply chain. I mean, why would it be okay for the tech industry to not, completely disrespect labor rights and actually have people working for free? When we complain about this in like other industries, like the textile industry and all of these other industries, right? I mean, that's not going to cut it either in the long term. So yeah, I would, as a, if I like when I advise my clients, I tell them, yeah, look at the security of what you're running right now, but also think about long term. And it's a great time to think about this long term because you can literally be a driver of changing the industry. I mean, like the work that you all are doing here, like Per and Phoebe, like this has extremely positive impact on how your organizations are perceived by the industry and outside of the industry. I mean, this is impactful in terms of hiring people that are going to work for you because they care. I mean, this is like well known in how corporations handle things like this, like ecological issues, labor issues. Like it's not different. We're just looking at open source in a really bizarre way, just like it's something special. It's not.
Yeah, I really want. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Phoebe. Go ahead.
I really want the part of what I'm working towards at DigitalOcean is having more communication with the engineering side of marketing and engineering, talking more to each other because there are many silos. Like I don't have visibility into everything that they're doing, and we have dependent open source projects that we rely on so heavily we could not operate our business without them, and we do give back to them, but I don't know how much that is, and I want to understand, like, okay, how reliant are we on them, and what are our, I guess, our vulnerabilities? Because if something happens to this particular project, I know there are many other people in the company who are aware of these things and looking at them, but we're not talking to each other yet. So I'm trying to get us there. So we're holding roundtables internally, quarterly, to talk about open source and these kinds of things. But it goes directly to what you're talking about, Toby, which is that we really do genuinely know that we are heavily reliant on open source, and so we want to give back. But if we aren't clear about how those open source technologies are being utilized, and there's no awareness across the entire organization, it's one thing to have an executive leader talking about how important it is, and it's a whole other thing to actually walk that talk with our syslog, right? Like to be like, hey, we know we're really reliant on you, we really want to give back to your organization. So yeah, I think that's where folks like who are working in open source program offices and open source programs are going to be really useful in trying to move things forward towards a more sustainable future, because we're not there right now.
Yeah, and I think it's very thought-provoking that when you look at companies' use of open source, a lot of companies don't even know what they have. They have no like asset management in regards to open source because it's free. You can just pull it in when teams can just do that. Any other commercial software you pay for, you have a clear contract, you have a support contract, you have a reassurances of the next 5 years of the roadmap of that product. But as soon as like it's open source, you just put it in there, and then when there's a security issue like Log4j, then you go and complain to the maintainers. And I think also on the Log4j issue, I think the irony here was that the maintainers fixed the thing within 2 days. But the reason why it kept being an ongoing problem was all these companies who realized, wait, do we have Log4j in there? Like no one knew, right? And I think like a month after the thing was announced, then SAP came out with, now we fixed it, by the way. So again, like even they didn't know that they had Log4j inside of their core products. And I think a lot of SAP users probably didn't know they used Log4j indirectly as well. So I think the whole premise, and I think also that's a good side effect of doing like funding, is that you actually figure out what do you depend on and have that conversation inside of your company.
I think that's a topic for a different day, about how many companies don't realize what resources are like in their code base.
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, spawns are going to become a requirement.
Forever. Sorry.
No, I'm sorry.
Now you can tell those companies forever that like you have a lot of open source in-house, even if you do not know it. Make sure that you know what you have. Make sure that you drive a program for that to at least, programmatically know what you have and support it. Buy support. Donate to their funds. But still, people are amazed by that they use Log4j somewhere. Well, how even is that possible?
Do you remember LeftPad?
Don't we all?
That was like, anyone could have written that function. Anyone could have copied that function into their code, but everyone, yeah.
So another thing, I see that we're at time actually, but I was wondering, so if you fund a project, would that like be the same as a monetary investment, or like what if an organization says, well, here is some engineering resources, let's direct them to your project? Is that a good thing that companies do that? And is that actually true? If a company like funds a project, can they expect to have their pull request prioritized or some influence on the roadmap?
We're all laughing because of a comment in the chat. Just for the people who are missing out on the chat.
You can't see that. Yeah.
I know that they can't, but like, I mean, everyone's laughing and we need to at least acknowledge that there's a back channel going on.
Yeah.
I think that the influence on roadmap is hard to just blanketly say that that's okay for companies to steer roadmaps on projects. I don't think you can expect that. I don't think it's a trade. Again, you get the software, and that's what you're paying for. You don't pay for political influence on where this project is going. I think all companies who have like a critical dependency on open source project, they should get involved so they are aware of where the project is going. And if they have specific features they care about, they can enter like a negotiation with the project if this makes sense to do, or if they should fork it and do it on their own. They're completely free to do so. But yeah, I don't think paying for code means that you then have influence over where a project is going.
No, and it's so easy to have influence by just doing the work, right? I mean, open source standard bodies, regardless of whatever governance they pretend that they're under, they are all duocracies, right? Like if you come, show up, and do the work, you're essentially making de facto decisions. Um, it happens like this pretty much all the time, pretty much across the board, and that is just normal. I mean, this is how if you look at politics, politics work exactly the same way, right? Lobbyists get what they want because they come with like a paper that explains the situation really well for the politician that can just essentially use those talking points. Yeah, sure, money, but like if you actually look at the money again, the money in lobbying is very tiny compared to like the impact that lobbying has. I mean, no wonder companies lobby. It is just like so worth it, right? And it's the same for I mean, why do you think large tech companies are so involved in open source and in standard bodies, right? Because the more involved they are, the closer what comes out actually serves their needs. I mean, this is pure capitalism at work. And hence, like if you want to influence a project, show up, do the work, right? And I agree. I don't think that actually like giving a tiny bit of money is going to help with that. Sure, if you're giving a significant amount, having like you would have for a nonprofit, like having a seat on the board of like the organization to check that the money is actually used for things that make sense for the business and not like weirdly, that could be understandable. If you're talking about like a sizable amount of money, right? But no, I'm totally with Per here. I don't think you should be able to buy influence that way. It's just already too easy to buy influence by just doing the work.
Just to say one other thing, which is a lot of the money in open source is not actually given to the open source. It's corporations that are paying for people to work in open source. So while we say that there isn't that much money or enough money in open source, like at our project, Google has a browser. They want their new APIs documented. They have a full-time employee who contributes to MDN on APIs that Google has, and that saves us a lot of time. But it is very much focused on their APIs. So you can't only have, corporate sponsored people, because then you only have corporate sponsored interests on the project. But yeah, donate to get your companies to donate to, if we're going to sum up anything, and if anyone made it to this point, reviewing this later on, if you work for a corporation, donate to open source. It's money well spent.
Okay, you shouldn't have said that. They're coming for you.
Yeah.
I live next to a hospital, so I said it with an ambulance in the background.
Oh, that's okay. Good. Otherwise, just say so. We'll just like quit on the spot. Now, I lost my thought train there for a minute. How do you like? I like to look at the Open Collective. I said before, I think. So I noticed that like huge projects or foundations get a lot of money. How should company make decisions on where to put the money? Like, for instance, I have one example. It was a foundation and they had like tons of money, which I agree with Toby is in fact not much, but they have tons of money just in their balance and not spending it, like having huge donations over years and years, and it's not being spent. So how should companies maybe look at that and make sure that it does not end up at the largest projects only?
Well, this is actually a problem that we encountered with Hacktoberfest. Last year, we debuted a donations portal where you could either donate through Open Collective or you could donate through GitHub sponsors. And we really wanted to highlight projects that were not the most well-funded. They were smaller, very independent. And it is really tough because, first of all, it's hard to find them, to sort through. Like if you're an individual, like just on your own, and you're trying to go to GitHub or you're trying to go to Open Collective, how do you find them? It's really difficult. So I think it's on us as organizations. And that's the responsibility that I wanted to take with Hacktoberfest, is like, okay, it's my job to try and do that sorting work. And so, I think, there's opportunities there. I'm not saying we're doing a great job. I think that we could do a better job. But that would be one thing. And then also, just being aware. I mean, just having the awareness just right off the top when you're going to make your funding decisions, thinking, okay, Kubernetes, yes, we're very reliant on Kubernetes, but is that something that really needs our funding right now? Is there something else like Ceph that we're utilizing heavily that could use our funding more? These are sorts of the questions that I rely on engineering to help me kind of make decisions on, and why I ask those questions.
I think the answer is yes, they do. But that's a other story. I know you have some thoughts on this as well.
We've talked a little bit about different funding sources and how much people are funded and stuff like that, and how much an admin fee is. So if we use the analogy of nonprofits, there's certain nonprofits. So I used to donate a certain amount every year. Right now I don't have the income to do that, but before I used to donate a certain amount. And after a few years, I would stop donating to the places where I had been donating because there were so many other people donating to that place now. And then I'd go and try to find smaller places. But that's not what normal people do. So, there's a tendency if something is popular, everyone will donate to the exact same thing. Like there's a nonprofit called Equal Justice Initiative, and they are fantastic. Like totally, you should donate to them. But if you donated to them 10 years ago, you were one of the few people donating to them. And if you donated to them now, you're one of the millions of people donating to them. So, it's best to go find someplace else. But that's, people in general are lazy, and they donate to the person that calls them on the phone and says, hey, do you want to donate to this cause? It's like, well, if you're calling me on the phone, you already have $1 million worth of marketing budget. So you don't actually need my 50 cents. Whereas the place that isn't reaching out to you is the place that does need your 50 cents because they don't have the staff to actually reach out and call. So it would be great if places like DigitalOcean actually, when they're doing their research, was like, here are 40 really worthwhile causes this year that you should consider that have a budget right now under $500,000 or some limit. Let's make them a big a big open source project. Because once a place, oh, go ahead.
No, I thought you were done. I'm sorry. You're good?
I was, and I continued because more time. Okay.
So OpenSSF has been doing a significant amount of work to identify the 10,000 most used open source project, and out of those, the sort of like the 100 critical ones. I would argue that we would need a foundation-like structure that would do the same thing that is being done for Open Web Docs, but for open source software more broadly. And that could probably leverage, was just out of scale, be able to have in-house a bunch of things that for something the size of Open Web Docs is too difficult to do. And as a result, you have to rely on costly sort of like third-party services to handle healthcare and like pay people to do, all of that admin work. That nonprofit structure would need to identify within those projects those that actually need money. And I'm only talking about maintenance here. I'm not talking about developing new features or any of that kind of stuff, right? It's really just about maintenance, triaging bugs, updating security patches, all of that work, right? All of the work that needs to get done to sustain the ecosystem. Out of those 10,000 projects, like how many projects actually need help? LeftPad is a great example. Like, LeftPad is probably in those 10,000 projects, right? Does it need maintenance? Nah, right? I mean, you could literally have one person doing maintenance for like 100 things like LeftPad all together, right? So, leverage the scale of an organization like this and actually identify the needs of those different projects. And I mean, do you all know like the budget that the Linux Foundation has yearly? I mean, I'm just like, that number is public, so I'm just going to give it away, right? It's $100 million.
I think
That's
it's
a ton of
177
money.
million.
Probably. I mean, it's maybe more now. The last time I looked, it was 100, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, that kind of money exists, and like, you have one foundation that has that kind of money. Other foundations have like not as much, but there's similar amounts of money in a whole bunch of tech foundations, right? Yeah, the Linux Foundation is by far the biggest, absolutely. But I mean, we can actually, like, as an industry, we know how to get $100 million in the foundation and do stuff with it to help like the open source ecosystem, right? Like, why can't we do just exactly the same thing and actually fund maintenance of a whole bunch of like projects that we collectively identify as being worth funding because they're part of the collective infrastructure, and B, actually needing money, right? Like, it sounds like a crazy and wild idea, but it's not so much of a stretch from what we're doing already, right? And yes, there are technical aspects of paying certain projects, et cetera, like, absolutely. I'm not saying that this is like easy to do, but we could actually seriously consider it. And I think that's a much more effective solution than having a whole bunch of OSPOs across the whole tech industry let's throw 10K here. Well, we're going to spend like a full person's salary, on trying to figure out like how to spend $100,000. It's ridiculous. Like, it doesn't, like, those numbers are not going to add up. And we can't also expect individuals, as Estelle was saying, to, do the work of, I'm using these 4 projects, they have these 12 dependencies, and those have 100 dependencies. And out of there, everyone's going to do their own research and pick the one that actually needs $10. Also doesn't work, right? So I think we need like a real industry. Sorry, no, I'm done. I'm sorry.
You had a good run here. It was a good run. Yeah. So I think you're right about some things here. I think you're maybe also wrong about something. I think on the aspect of like OSPOs and individual companies investing into open source projects, it's not the only thing they do. They don't use a full-time salary just to find investment targets. That's like one thing. And I think the other part is it's actually.
I did not mean to say this. I know. I want to apologize right away. You did not mean to say this.
So I'm just saying, I think it's a good mechanism that company actually invest in the things they care about. I think that's actually a good, like, borderline capitalistic thing to do, that a company cares about things they invest in. So I think that part is good. I don't think, as I totally agree, it's not the most efficient thing, and we're not really holding companies accountable of actually doing that. Then the other part of like this foundation, and I think maybe I just personally have like foundation fatigue here. But again, we have like the Linux Foundation with $177 million last year. OpenSSF raised what, 30 million with a battle in my eye. The Apache Foundation, the Eclipse Foundation, the Python Software Foundation, and so on. And to my knowledge, none of these foundations actually pay maintainers of open source projects. I know Linux Foundation.
No, they don't. That's my whole point.
Linux. What?
That's my whole point. They don't, and that's my whole point.
They don't.
And they rely on them. They should be spreading the love. They should be. I mean, if they have a full-time person or many who are able to fundraise, they should be giving out grants.
Yeah, But they don't, and these foundations don't do it. And as far as I understood, at least from the Apache Foundation, they were limited in how they can actually pay out this money because of their bylaws of that specific foundation. That is probably a problem that can be fixed.
Yes, absolutely. As you know, as Open Web Docs has fixed it, it is fixable.
Yep.
And you know, people are sometimes questioning like how accountable those organizations are. Like, sure, I mean, those are a very good question. Like, there is, I mean, again here, like there are a well-known mechanism that these organizations are following. Like they have boards. Those boards are elected by the membership that are giving them money. Like, you know, I mean, you can't do more accountable than this to some degree, right? And that's sort of like perceived, like accepted industry-wide and other nonprofits as being the way that you hold these things accountable. And there's a justice system on top of it, right? So like I'm not too concerned about this. Yes, it's technically difficult to actually have people working for membership-driven organizations be paying for development. Like I agree, it's a complex. There are complex legal issues around this, but I mean, come on, like tech industry has great lawyers, like lots of them, right? Like none of this. If there is a will to change that, like none of this is impossible, right? I'm just not seeing a will, and I'm just seeing people being. You know, it's. I don't want to bash on the folks that are giving 100K a year because that's a lot of money and it's great, and you're the only one doing that, right? But like, if like we have to not tap on our back saying that this is great and that this is enough. Like there has to be like a really big mindset shift, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I agree on the mindset change. I also think the only thing I have with this fund is, what if your project is not part of those 10,000s? How will you ever get funding? Because if everyone is paying that fund, they paid their tax for open source. And so what about the projects outside those 10,000s? And what about the projects that is not deemed worthy by whoever is sitting in that fund? But we just end up having a central point of control of who actually can make money inside of open source.
I don't know if I want to have this conversation. I think it's like technicalities, and I think we can solve these problems. And like, yes, no solution is perfect, and yes, always. But I mean, we can work around this with like multiple, you know, diverse governance, multiple bodies of governance that represent like the community. Like there are lots of different ways. And like, you know, my point was like we can start with a list of like we know what the 10K projects are. I don't know what the long tail is. Like I haven't like, but like there's data around this, right? And maybe the long tail is like 100K. I don't know. But it's like this stuff is doable. That's kind of my point. Like we're actually like talking about projects that, I mean, Babel is used by like literally everyone, right? And it's one of the most funded projects was like Webpack, right? And you're looking at like how much money they're getting, like barely to pay a full-time salary a year. So, you know, by the time that we solve that problem more broadly, and like we're actually like successfully paying for like a 10K projects to be maintained properly, like I am absolutely sure walking to like a 100K project is not going to be a problem. Like I think, yeah, I mean there like was like every time you give money to somewhere and you have some form of control, like that's an issue. But right now the control is literally who has the network to go knock on the doors of like large corporations to get that money. That's not good either, right? Like no solution is perfect. And you know, and again, like I'm with you. Like I'm a small business owner. Like I believe like it's great if you can run open source projects and make money off of it. You know, full on. And those two things can coexist 100% and should.
I think this kind of speaks to having, like, kind of going back to what Estelle was saying about like having the resources to actually ask for money. I mean, most of the people that reach out to me are the maintainers themselves. They don't have people who our fundraising specialists, right? So it's really hard to know where to go and who to connect with. And so maybe there needs to be some sort of intermediary, and I hate to say the word foundation, but foundation.
It's not a dirty word. I mean, yeah, sure, there's lots of issues, but like there are lots of issues with everything, right? I mean, governments are terrible, corporations are terrible, nonprofits are terrible. Like the word, I mean, the world is a difficult place with lots of imperfection. God, I ruined the atmosphere again.
No, I was actually looking up who funds Babbel. So
Yeah.
Babbel is funded by mostly Airbnb, AMP Project, Salesforce, and then the fourth largest contributor is Front End Masters, which is a training class for front end engineers. That should not be the case considering how many companies are using Babbel. Like, I'm not sure if it's that sad or pathetic. I'm thinking the latter.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's great that all these companies are funding smaller projects. Yeah. So I mean, there's just not enough money. That's what the problem is.
But there absolutely is enough money. I mean, if we look at the US
in the industry,
we like there's tons of money. It's just where is that money going? Elon Musk is a multi-billionaire. His engineer, I don't think they have a huge engineering team. I don't think they're donating anywhere to open source projects. And yet that car is running on open source projects. So there is money. It's just very few people choose to contribute. And it's the same names over and over again when you're looking at who's contributing.
I don't know if this is, I mean, I have a sense that this has been a problem with open source from the very beginning, right? But it feels like to me, and maybe this is just my being new in the space relatively, is just how much more aware we are becoming that this is an issue. I think that we're on the cusp of seeing change. And maybe that's just my glass half full, hopeful side. But just because we're having this conversation, right? Like we're talking about the issues that are core to open source today. And I think that the more that we keep talking about it, the more we keep bringing it out, the more individual companies, Per and I are working on trying to solve. Cheerleading for open source.
So
I mean, we have to account for. Oh, sorry. Please.
Now we have come to.
If you want to close, we should. It's like
discuss open source. We have already come to. We need an open source foundation to rule the foundations. We need an open source union for open source contributors and maintainers. Companies need to step up their money. Like it's amazing that we literally had this discussion like a year ago, and still like we become more aware, but we still have a long road ahead to drive awareness for this. And I'm thinking that besides projects needing to reach out, companies need to do their due diligence on their what they're using, and B where they spend their money at. Projects also maybe sometimes need to spend more on things like marketing, maybe making people more aware of that there is this project. Maybe even like if we also have a union and yet another foundation, we should maybe have open source lobbyists or something.
We have those already. Like literally in Brussels, it's a thing.
There's an open source lobbyist?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's actually true. Yeah, it is.
A number of large corporations have pointed that. Just saying.
I don't know, at the beginning of this conversation, I was thinking about who does the work in society and who gets paid for it. And so I always think of like, everyone's like, why should a McDonald's worker get paid $15 an hour? And I'm like, have you ever worked at McDonald's? Have you ever worked as hard as someone who works at McDonald's? I don't know. My job is way cushier than a job at McDonald's, and I get paid much better than a job at McDonald's. But open source, it's kind of like, at least in the U.S. society, it's the people that make things run every single day that get the least amount of funding. So whether that's, the bus drivers, the street cleaners, the people serving you coffee, those are all the people that aren't making the money. And so in tech, it's the people that are creating all those dependencies that you rely on that are making way less than the people who are using those dependencies. And it should be kind of the other way around. Companies should realize how much money they're saving by having open source. And if they're saving 5 years of annual salary because they use all open source projects, they should at least fund one full-time annual salary to work on open source projects. I'm done.
I think my favorite story about the McDonald's salaries is that I think the McDonald's salary in the US is what, $7, $15 maybe, and
$7.25.
$7.25, or the minimum wage. And in Denmark, the wage of a McDonald's worker is, I guess, like tenfold that. And we don't have a minimum wage in Denmark. The reason why these people actually pay much more in Denmark, and McDonald's can charge the same for a burger in Denmark, actually cheaper actually, is because there's a union. These people are supported by a union. They actually have actual bargaining power, and they were actually just like, well, we're not going to work then. And all the other unions also supported them in doing that, saying, well, we're not going to deliver any goods to your restaurants if you don't pay a actual livable wage to these workers. So maybe that's where the problem is, that open source workers don't really have any bargaining power right now. If you don't participate in open source, then your resume is not going to look very good. Like, you want to engage in open source because of the interesting work and the exposure, and it's like a good thing for your career and all that. It's a good perk and all that. But it also puts everyone who is actually contributing in a situation that they can't really opt out. And maybe the companies actually know that there is no bargaining power on the production side here.
On that happy note.
I feel like it's the Europeans being very gloomy today. Sorry.
No, I mean,
it's just real. It's just realness that you're serving us today.
If we were gloomy about every topic in the United States, we'd all be like completely depressed.
Yeah.
We don't have unions. Yeah. We don't have time off. We don't have a living minimum wage. We have school shootings. It's and yesterday was the election, and that was bad too. So that's where I was like, money. Someone came into San Francisco and kicked out the DA just by making a huge amount of contribution, because the DA was working on getting lost wages, stolen wages, because if you work overtime, you're supposed to get paid overtime, and that's what he was working on. So corporations paid to convince people that murder rates were up in San Francisco and boot them out. And murder rates are not up in San Francisco. So even in a liberal mecca like San Francisco, conservative money talks, corporate money talks. So on that happy note, yeah, I think we should.
Well, that escalated quickly.
Yeah, you're making me all sound like completely within bounds, which is not that easy. Thank you.
All right.
I think in all fairness, it was Toby who started it with the gloom and doom. So I'm just saying, Toby started.
Yeah. Totally.
I just want to know one thing before we go. I just want to know one thing, Toby. How do you feel about actual physical contributions to open source projects? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Was that question to me?
Yes. Yeah,
I've spent all of my career in open source. I mean, I love this community, and I love people working together, connecting across different countries, different organizations to work together to build stuff that they can all use, that's amazing. I mean, the fact that I'm there trying to like help make this be less of a hellhole for some people, right? It's because I deeply care and because it is so meaningful, right? So absolutely. I mean, I have a bunch of talks that are just like about how um, organizations that actually help their employees contribute get a ton of benefit and how it is super positive for them to do that. And for, so I deeply care. I think organizations should absolutely contribute as much as possible. Like my sort of dream state of the world is one where everyone just works in the open and in open technology. That's the thing that makes sense and moves as much of their work there as makes sense for them, right? And for the projects where that doesn't work, because of how that project is structured, there is a collective way of supporting maintenance of those projects. How exactly that's done? No, like we can figure this out, right? But no, absolutely. What doesn't work, however, is when you have corporations that kind of like come dump in contributions and leave, right? Or come like fork a project at a bunch of things that works for them and are pissed off when the maintainers don't want them, right? So like that's where there's a tension. Yeah, the more we talk, the less filter I have. It's like it's been an hour and a half, folks. What do you expect? I can maintain face like for a long time. I can't, right? So yeah, no. So I think it's great, but it has to like help. It can't just be about like. I mean, in general, corporations have to understand they're part of an ecosystem, right? Not only for technology, for everything. And when corporations just like have complete disregard for the ecosystem, you literally have to have like the law step in to like make them not do things that are going to hurt everyone, including themselves, in like a couple of years, right? So like I personally like prefer it when we don't have to have governments write up laws about how the tax should work because that tends to like go sideways. But like when that's not possible, or when like we end up in cases where it's necessary, like I absolutely approve of like governments and countries protecting people and environment from like unhealthy corporate practices. But I don't think we're there at all. Like I think corporations can see the benefit right here, right there of contributing and maintaining that ecosystem, right? We just have to tell that story better.
I think there can be enough contributions being done by corporations. The more they invest in engineering power for open source projects, I think the better. And yes, sure, if they add something they think is useful for their business case, that's totally fine. But like you put it, like don't just dump your stuff and leave extra burden and burn out the maintainers. That's not a good thing. But in general, yeah, why not? I think like literally, like if you look at like how Linux evolved over the years, you've seen a lot of commercial contributions funded by large corporations. So
97%, I think, is the last number came out. 93 and 97 is corporate contributions to the Linux project.
Yeah, the rest of us just have to emulate them. Just kidding. It's not, we can't all be 177 or $200 million companies. But it would be nice to know that that we have because I just looked at our budget, we have about 9 to 10 months of runway right now, and that's it's not stressful because I don't look at it. And now that I looked at it, because we had this conversation, I'm like, and so if you want to hire people, you can't hire people when you're when you don't have a good runway. But then if you have too many people looking at your financials, they're kind of like, you're sitting on so much money, why don't you spend it? So, running a nonprofit, or an open source project, is kind of difficult, because the people who are donating are saying, oh, you already have so much money, you don't need mine. Whereas when you have employees, you're like, we need to have a 1.5 year runway. So it's a fine line. And mostly I think it comes down to educating donors. So yeah, we do need a foundation for open source foundations. A foundation to help build foundations, basically.
Cool. So I think that we should round up. Any last thoughts? Anyone? Donate money, more money. Don't stop donating. Thank you.
I'm sure Toby has more hot takes.
No, I'm running out of swear words.
Oh, good. Thank you. People, there's a code of conduct.
Donate your money, donate your time, contributors. If you work for a company, let them use, offer up your services as mentors, and as people that, your expertise, because we don't really need you to come in and help on things we don't need help on, but we'd love to have you help us when we actually need help. And also change the mindset to get your corporations to view this as, we're saving you 5 annual salaries a year, so contribute 1 annual salary per year, and then you'll have better open source projects and stable. They'll be there and maintained for years to come. Those are my closing words. Oh, and donate to openwebdocs.org.
Yes, you did it. Cool. Folks, thank you so much for joining us for this meetup on open source funding and sponsorship. I think we will have the same discussion next year. So Floor, please schedule that one. We will hopefully be a lot wiser. Maybe we will have a foundation. Maybe we will have a open source laborers union. Who knows what this year will bring? Maybe we will have a sponsor fest.
I would love to get one of those lobbyists on here. I want to hear from them.
Yeah, that's a good one. Let's try. I know that some people are watching who might know people. So, anyways, yeah, thank you so much for joining. There's some housekeeping things. Oh yeah, you can watch the recordings online on the website. They will be up soonish, maybe at the end of this week. We will not be there next month because we are taking a well-deserved break and try to reflect and reconsider some things, like should we use a swear jar? But also there's a large event coming up locally, so maybe we'll do something around KubeCon, which will be in Amsterdam next year. So yeah, keep an eye out on the Twitters and on our website, and join us in September for one on open source security. That will be a fun discussion. Thank you, Phoebe. Thank you, Per. Thank you, Toby. Thank you, Estelle, for joining. It was really great having you here. And let's do the awkward wave like that. Yeah, cool.